And take it away.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Michelle. I'm gonna get my screen share going. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Is this in presenter mode? Is this okay?
Yes, you're looking good.
Okay, cool. So my presentation is titled In and on the Soil, the Power of Community in Climate Adaptation and Resilience. So as mentioned, this year I served as a fellow with UC Cooperative Extension Small Farms Program in Fresno County, right in the middle of California. And I worked with their small farms team on a variety of projects, which I'll talk briefly about, but a lot of what I focused on was rooted in soil health and what it looks like to implement healthy soils practices on small diversified farms in Fresno County. So really quick, a bit about Fresno. Fresno sits on unceded lands of Yokut and Mono peoples, and it's home to about 1.72 million acres of farmland, with agriculture covering almost half of the county's land base. And while there are more than 300 different crops grown in Fresno, the top 10 in economic value include almonds, grapes, pistachios, poultry, milk, garlic, cattle, tomatoes, mandarins, and oranges. So because Fresno is one of the top producing agricultural counties in the nation and the landscape is dominated by industrial agriculture, people often question if regenerative agriculture is happening here. As you drive through on the 99, sometimes it's hard to envision. And as you all know, this fellowship is focused on regenerative agriculture. So sometimes when I tell people that, they often look at me like, there in Fresno? But my counter to that is that, first of all, there are incredible farmers in Fresno County growing in innovative, diversified ways. They're just smaller scale and don't dominate the landscape in the same way that big agriculture does. Many of them are immigrant and refugee farmers, and our team predominantly works with the Southeast Asian farming community. Second, regenerative agriculture cannot be achieved if it removes the human element from our agricultural ecosystems. So to reduce our thinking to only soil carbon only further exemplifies injustices in our food production systems. So what is cooperative extension? We've heard a lot about resource conservation districts today, but cooperative extension is a little bit different, though serves some of the same functions. But cooperative extension is operated through the nation's land-grant university system in partnership with federal, state, and local governments. So agricultural extension agents provide advice, information, and other support services to farmers. Land-grant universities were established in 1862 under the Morrill Act. They were specifically for teaching agriculture and mechanical arts. And then the Hatch Act in 1887 allowed for the creation of agricultural experiment stations for research. And then finally, the Smith-Lever Act in 1914 formalized the Cooperative Extension Service for research and outreach. So essentially, the idea is that extension was to serve as a bridge between academics working in agricultural research and farmers. And extension professionals also do their own research within the communities they live and work. They help connect farmers to markets and navigate different regulatory requirements. So engaging in healthy soils work with cooperative extension has been really cool, and experiencing the landscape of farming in Fresno has forced me to take a step back. As was mentioned, I went to undergrad at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and recently finished my master's in soil science and international agricultural development at UC Davis, which are both land-grant universities. So working for cooperative extension has been a goal of mine. Having spent the last 2 years studying soil health principles, I really wanted to understand how these principles looked in practice. And I really wanted to do that through the Small Farms program. I love research and science, but during grad school within the UC system, I really started to question this idea of who the science of the University of California is serving and what types of agricultural production it was uplifting through its research. So scientists are often encouraged to work on important problems, and what's important is defined in large part by the political, economic, social system in which we live. California marketing orders have been particularly influential in lobbying for commodity-specific research in the state, which has served to leave a lot of smaller diversified farmers out of agriculture research. But I had read a lot about the Small Farms program in Fresno and their efforts to serve and uplift farmers who have historically been underserved and focus on diversified farming. Especially in a place that's dominated by monocultures at the landscape scale, this is really important. And that's why I really wanted to work here. So the beauty of creating and sustaining healthy soil communities is analogous to creating healthy agricultural communities. And extension has a role to play here. So in our last training, we talked a lot about how human communities, it's like mycorrhizal fungal networks in the soil, where we form symbiotic relationships, helping each other grow and acquire what we need. So a lot of what I took away from this year is that community is the most powerful tool, both in the soil and for those who stand on it. Regenerative agriculture puts a lot of emphasis on soil health and the ability of soil to sequester carbon through certain practices. But this year has really redefined what regenerative agriculture means to me and given me a good grounding as to how to operate as a soil scientist moving forward. And this quote I really like by Wendell Berry that sums some of this up is that the soil is the great connector of lives, the source and destination of all. It is the healer and restorer and resurrector by which disease passes into health, age into youth, death into life. Without proper care for it, we can have no community, because without proper care for it, we can have no life. So I'm going to structure the rest of my presentation through the lens of soil health principles that I learned by studying soil in a university setting and how they relate to what I did and what I learned by being on the ground in Fresno this year. So first of all, when we talk about soil health, we talk a lot about needing to feed our soils, not just feed plants through inorganic fertilizers, but feed microbes through carbon-rich inputs like cover crop residue or compost. But we also need to feed those who are working on the soil. And this is what I mean about not being able to remove the human component from our agricultural ecosystems. So similar to how removing crop residue from a field and not putting any back will deplete the soil over time, the money produced by big agriculture is not necessarily going back into the communities that are generating wealth for the state. So regenerative agriculture cannot be achieved if it removes questions of social justice, accountability, and governance from its frameworks. And these issues are front and center in a place like Fresno, in which much of the economic activity around agriculture has been extractive. And this is why I believe it's incredibly important to uplift smaller growers who are often providing food for their own communities. Another part of maintaining healthy soils is making sure that life in the soil has a diversity of resources to survive and thrive. There has been research on how providing soil microbial communities with many resources will improve soil function and the resilience of soil to bounce back from disturbance. California signed the Farmer Equity Act into law in 2017, and this act recognized that there are certain groups of farmers who have not had access to resources and information in the same way as others. And this act is supposed to be considered when providing funding for climate smart agriculture practices, which includes the Healthy Soils program. So this year I had the opportunity to work on supporting the implementation of healthy soils practices on small farms that received grant funding from CDFA. This included 2 demonstration projects and about 11 different farms who received incentive money to either spread compost, plant cover crops, or plant a hedgerow or windbreak. And really a lot of this coordination came from my coworker, Mariana, and I was helping to soil sample and create some educational materials for farmers. We created videos and other media content about some of these healthy soils practices. Being on the ground with these farmers helped me to really get to know them and understand the challenges they face when it comes to these sorts of incentive programs. From the researcher's perspective, the Healthy Soils program seems great. But I learned that incentive programs are not generally made with small diversified farms in mind, and that even though California has the Farmer Equity Act, equity really needs to take into account the resources that farms have available when creating equitable payment rates for incentives. So our program was able to buy a compost spreader that farmers can borrow, and we have a cover crop seeder that they can use. And we're also working to expand our lending to a library, so that's something that I'm helping with. But really thinking about the idea that equity is not just giving a farmer cover crop seeds. It's making sure they have equipment to plant those seeds and that they understand how and why they're planting those seeds. Similar to how the resources available to soil microbial community impacts its function, resources available to farmers in the form of equipment, information, and technical assistance are crucial to their ability to implement soil health practices. You'll need to add more compost to a soil that's heavily depleted than you would to a field that's rich in carbon and nutrients. Moving forward, entities like CDFA need to be thinking about equity beyond simply representation of who receives awards, and this is something that I strive to advocate for. So takeaways from working with the Healthy Soils program is that sustainability is a byproduct of justice and equity. So when farmers are supported, sustainability follows. Another thing we talk about in soil science is heterogeneity of soil microbial communities at the field scale. So one farm is not going to have homogeneous soil, and there often needs to be different considerations based on those differences. This goes for California as a state. Soil health practices that work in one part of the state are not necessarily going to work the same way in another. And here you can see how precipitation varies throughout the state, as well as soil types. So another project I got to organize was a cover crop research trial to look at different seed mixes that perform well here. Again, thinking about regionally specific resources and information. So much of the information that's currently out there on cover crops either comes from the Midwest or other parts of California that get more rain. So we wanted to understand what seed mixes perform well here and how they grow with the little rainfall we receive. So this trial was a big undertaking, but a lot of fun because I got to collaborate with a bunch of different people and expand my own network. I was able to take on a leadership role with experimental design, data collection, and analysis. And I had the opportunity to present in a webinar, on a podcast, and wrote an article about this trial. And I'll be presenting about it in a couple of conferences in the fall as well. Symbiosis also happens through workshops, and we held some of these this year around food safety, pesticide safety, weed management, integrated pest management, and compost spreader use, to name a few. And having these workshops is a two-way sharing of knowledge and information, and it's a way to strengthen the network with, or our network with, the farming community. I also got to assist our team in helping farmers fill out regulatory paperwork, as well as apply for COVID relief. Learning to navigate government paperwork is less glamorous, but an important part of making sure farmers are supported and able to survive. Most small-scale farmers can't absorb the financial shocks that result from losing markets or having to pay huge fees for not properly complying with regulations, which really are targeted at larger growers and don't make as much sense for small-scale farmers, but that's a whole other conversation. I also got to assist on our research trial with my colleague Hardeep that is based on Moringa production. So Moringa is a plant known for its high nutritional content that originated in India and is grown by a lot of South and Southeast Asian producers in the valley. So we're collecting agronomic data on its water and fertilizer needs. And Moringa is very drought tolerant, which is something that is incredibly important to this part of California. It's also culturally relevant to many of the small farmers here. And that's another piece, representation of crops that aren't those top 10 economically important crops in research is really important for communities to feel seen and like they're part of the fabric of California agriculture rather than separate from it. So UC Cooperative Extension plays an important role in recognizing this. Another hot topic, and then regenerative agriculture practices must be locally adapted, culturally relevant, and community driven was the takeaway from these projects. Another topic in regards to soil health is disease suppression and what players in the microbial community help the soil fight diseases that could damage crops. So again, this disease suppressive power is closely related to the health of the soil microbial community. As many of you know, we were dealing with the global pandemic throughout the whole fellowship year. And fighting such a pandemic requires a community response. It's important to pay attention to agricultural workers, particularly small farmers and farm workers for whom English is not their first language. Before the vaccines were being rolled out, we held many events in which we passed out PPE to farmers, which included masks, hand sanitizer, gloves, information. And then once vaccinations were rolled out, I was able to help my coworker Lillian at some vaccination events targeted at farm workers in the Southeast Asian community. This virus is a great example of how community health is intrinsically tied to the health, well-being, and access of all community members. Finally, there's an emphasis on diversity in regenerative agriculture, microbial diversity, as well as crop diversity above ground. But crop diversity is driven by cultural diversity. If we have farmers from different backgrounds that use different crops culinarily, we will inherently have diversity at the landscape scale. And this is another reason why it's incredibly important to uplift small diversified farms. Even though industrial agriculture is all around us, these farms serve as biodiversity hotspots. And this diversity of the producers themselves is what drives this. However, this is not something that is incentivized with climate smart agriculture programs or a move to regenerative agriculture, because these programs and this way of thinking require farmers to adopt new practices. But what if they're already practicing agriculture based off of regenerative principles? So the final takeaway is that regenerative agriculture, in the way we talk about it, is often built on a framework of erasure of credit and acknowledgement of BIPOC communities and their knowledge, as well as the erasure of their leadership in conversations around the future of food. So it's becoming more and more obvious that climate change is impacting the valley in a big way, and this has huge implications for food production in the future. It's essential that we work towards creating a more just and sustainable food production system, and I believe the way we do that is by supporting and uplifting small-scale diversified farmers and focusing on the health of soils and our agricultural communities. To sum up my journey in redefining regenerative agriculture cannot be achieved if it removes questions of social justice, accountability, and governance from its frameworks. Sustainability is a byproduct of justice and equity. Regenerative agriculture practices must be locally adapted, culturally relevant, and community-driven. And all farmers must be part of the conversation around the future of food production. I feel really lucky that I was able to expand my network and community this year. I'm sorry if you hear a train going by. I live very close to a train. I would like to extend my gratitude to the small farms team that took me in and taught me so much this year. I'd also like to thank the climate smart agriculture specialists who worked on the cover crop trial with me. And there are so many others to thank for the grounding and learning that I got to do this year. And as we know, it takes time to build healthy soils, just as it takes time to build community. And that's why I'm super happy to say that I'm staying on with the small farms team as a staff member, and I'm looking forward to continuing the work that we started this year. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessie. That was a really incredible overview to see the different facets of work that you've been doing in Fresno. But yeah, with that, we would like to open this up to questions from folks in the audience or in general. So feel free to either plug them into the chat, into the Q&A option, or raise your hand. Wonderful. We have a question from Oya who says, amazing presentation, Jessie, and asks if you have any upcoming or ongoing projects that you're excited about.
I mean, so many things. I feel like as many of other fellows have kind of discussed, is there's only so much you can do in a year. And I feel like this year was really like laying the groundwork and foundation for me. And I think I'm excited to kind of expand more of this healthy soils work and conversation. I think this cover crop trial was a really good launching point for future research that we'll do with small diversified farms and trying to fit in more of these healthy soils practices through more of a crop rotation framework, which there's not as much information and research out there on that. So I'm excited to dive into that more and just dig into the Fresno community more as well.
And our next question then is from the manager at East Merced, who first notes that your work is thoroughly impressive and asks if you can talk a bit about cover cropping test results.
Yeah, so a lot of what we were looking at, it is primarily a variety trial. We just wanted to see what seed mixes and varieties performed well. So a lot of what we were measuring was growth, but we also looked at water infiltration, and we did some soil testing as well. So we found that there were certain grasses that put on more biomass than others. And then we were looking at different levels of irrigation. So we had half of the field that was receiving irrigation water and another half that was completely dependent on the rainfall that we received this year. So there's a lot of, people have a lot of ideas that you can't plant cover crops in this part of California because we get so little rain, but we kind of wanted to see if we could disprove that and if there were benefits that we could find by just having ground cover, even if it wasn't a crazy amount of biomass. And so that's kind of what we found broadly. But if you're interested in more specific data points or analysis of those results, feel free to reach out to me.
Wonderful. And yeah, does anyone have any more questions that they would like to ask Jessie? One more moment. Great. Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much, Jessie, for an incredible presentation and an incredible year with GrizzlyCorps. I'm so excited that you will continue to stay in the network.
Me too. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. And with that,